What is the future of production software? I mean, I think that we're in a period now where we're in the Mechs era, right? Like we're in the Mechs era. What I mean by that is when we put on Claude Code, it's like strapping, a mechanized armor suit onto the human, making them super powerful, making them more capable. I think that what we'll increasingly do is move to a more industrial approach where people are spent setting up the robot armies. The effort will go into setting up, being the prime movers of software that generates software.
Welcome to At the Intersection. I'm your host, Jim Anderson, and today I'm joined by John Maxwell, Beacon's Chief Technology Officer. John's had a long and storied career in technology, and I've worked with him across multiple companies. And today we're going to dive into everything from vibe coding to dark software factories and so much more. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So let's talk about the CTO who no longer writes code anymore. That's kind of a trope out there on LinkedIn, et cetera. And guess what? You're a CTO. So I have a question for you. Like, are you a CTO who writes code, or are you a CTO who doesn't write code? And help me understand just a little bit about like how do you think about it? Like, should the CTO be writing code? I don't even know. Tell me what your current thoughts are, recognizing that I'm asking you today and your answer tomorrow or next week or next month could be very different. I don't know.
I am historically a CTO who writes code. I think there are differing opinions about whether a CTO should write code or not. I think it's generally pretty accepted that an early stage CTO would write code, and that has historically been what I've done. That said, of course, AI is changing that a lot. I don't write the lines of code myself anymore. Claude helps me write them. And I don't think that's restricted to CTOs. I think that's software engineers at large. But yes, my relationship to writing code is certainly changing as a result of AI coding assistance that's available.
Okay, so a lot to untangle there. I get, early stage, of course, you're going to be more hands-on. I think that's true for every function, not simply software development. So that makes sense, checks out. But let's go back to the idea that everybody's job, even people who are not the CTO, software developers, their job's changing. And I've heard people talk about, okay, some software developers don't write code anymore, that, Claude or any of the other tools out there can write it for you. But then I've also seen, but you can't really trust that, number one. And B, even if you could trust it, you can only do it 3 hours a day. Like help me understand, just never mind the CTO perspective, just software development in general. How is it today different than it was, say, 6 or 12 or 18 months ago?
Yeah, AI has changed the way a lot of us work. Previously, for a lot of functions, whether that's software engineering or some other function, you would need to research something to find out how to do it, what to write, like what the topic is. And I think for a software engineer, that's certainly true. I would historically find out what the options were, find out what the APIs are. So there would be a lot of that kind of research, kind of like going to the library and doing your research and then coming back to your workspace of your coding editor and trying to apply it and trying to get it working. And so now we can just tell AI what we want. It generates the files. So the step of sort of research, it comes up with an implementation plan. So the research is not really there anymore. At least it's not as onerous. And then, of course, writing every line down is it takes care of that for you too. So really, you're kind of in the driver's seat as an architect, making sure that the shape of the implementation is what you want and what you're looking for. I've personally found transitioning from spending a lot of my career in Ruby on Rails to here at Beacon doing Python and Django, I found it to be very beneficial because I'll know how to do something in Ruby on Rails. I built 20 years of experience doing that. And then, I can say, I should be able to do this in this new technology stack. How could we get this done? And then I just eyeball it and say that looks good. So that's kind of how it's changed the job, is that normal cycle of I have a problem to solve. Therefore, I need to Google it and find out some things about it that I'm going to bring back and apply. That's AI models have like eaten the internet. And so they can just answer those questions and those challenges directly.
So that makes a lot of sense. The research upfront investigation, much easier, much less time consuming. That's great. Big win, and we'll call that, people bandy about numbers, which I think, are all should be treated with skepticism, including the ones I'm about to mention, right? Is, 30% more productive just because, the research is so much easier and more seamless and more tailored. And, it's not the traditional Google, let me go find a bunch of blue links and I'll go do research and synthesize in my own brain, at least in theory. A lot of that synthesis can happen for you. So that makes a lot of sense. But I want to get into vibe coding because everybody talks about vibe coding these days, and I think it is misunderstood, I guess, for lack of a better term. And the reason that I say that is if I start to try to vibe code something, and I effectively literally have not programmed since the days of Fortran like 30 years ago. So I wasn't any good at it then either. So I know nothing about coding is probably the good default assumption. I've not done it. Certainly not professionally, and I'm not competent or capable to do that. So I could start vibe coding and I could start asking, I would use Claude Cowork instead of Claude Code because I don't know how to code in any kind of modern way. So I'd say, hey, I want you to build me an app and I want you to do all this kind of stuff. That's great. And it would start, I'd be off and running and I could spend hours iterating. And I've done some of that. So that makes sense. But if you start, number one, it's probably not vibe coding, it's coding. You're not starting with a vibe. You're starting with a 20 plus year set of experience in, as you said, knowing how to build things. So your prompts and what you ask it to do are bound to be like completely different than what I would ask. Is that it? First off, let me challenge that assumption. Is that fair that you would do it completely differently than I would?
Yeah, I think that is fair that I would bring my history of experience with solving the problem. And so I would approach it with a certain way, like, I already have a sort of idea about how this should be implemented. And that sort of cuts both ways. I do think it's beneficial to have some of that experience, but sometimes it can feel like you're holding the AI back by like imposing your own limitations as like a mortal, that hasn't eaten the whole internet and doesn't know the range of options. You're kind of bringing that to it. So I sort of have mixed feelings about that. But you're right. Like, since I do sort of am opinionated about the implementation, I'll approach the architecture and the prompt generally with like an implementation in mind. Sometimes I've started like sort of feeling it out first. Like, hey, let's have a conversation about this. Like, I want to do this thing. What do you think are the options? And that puts it on like sort of a Q&A. It can show me kind of what it thinks, and I can sort of weigh in on those things individually rather than just setting it on a certain course. And I think that can have good outcomes too.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. I'm particularly intrigued by, what I think you've said. You need to not, using my words, not yours, not overly limit or overly restrict it right out of the gate. Don't presume it can't do something because it has done a bunch of research. And so whatever ideas you might bring to the table might be overly constraining or at least preliminarily constraining. And so if you sort of turn it loose and let it be more expansive, you can always rein it back in because you've got the knowledge and experience to do that. But make sure you don't overly narrowly define the problem up front. Is that a fair interpretation of what you said?
That's a fair interpretation. The other thing is that we're still thinking about it like as a one-shot thing a lot of the times. Like, we're going to implement this once. That was certainly true when we wrote all of software. It was just too expensive to have a team of people work on a duplicate implementation a lot of times. It wasn't like practical. And I still think we're approaching the problem that way when it comes to AI. We're sort of retreading similar patterns. But like in the vibe coding book that Steve Yege co-wrote, they make the point that AI coding assistance is about optionality. So you can kind of also take this approach of, I know the right solution when I see it. You can spin up a couple of Claude Code sessions, have one go off in one direction, one go off in another direction, and then just look at the output and see which one you like better. I mean, I think that's one big benefit that kind of gets overlooked in this, is that since the cost of production is significantly lowered, you now can put yourself in that sort of final reviewer stage much more quickly.
Well, it's interesting to hear you say that because I'm reminded I was doing an interview of a software developer candidate, and he made a statement that at the time we were running out of time, so I didn't really have time to dig in. But what you just said reminded me of that. He said, A/B testing is really kind of expensive, and so sometimes you just have to trust your gut. And in some ways, that's the opposite of what you just said. Right now, software development's become so cheap. If you're having an agent, do it, or having Claude Code do it, that you could spin up 1, 2, 3, 4 different options with minimal extra cost. So let me, before I go on from there, because my next question is if you go from 4, how about if you did 44 or 444? At some point, there's got to be diminishing returns, and just the cost of all those options is high. But before I get to 44 or 444, 2, is A/B testing really expensive anymore, or is that a sort of an old assumption that should be challenged moving forward?
That's a good question. I think that there's still some expense associated with it, and there's still some organizational effort associated with it. When you A/B test something, you're rolling out 2 experiences by name, A and B, to the users. And so I think from a customer expectation management use case, and support use case, there's some organizational requirement to do that. So, and I think that doesn't go away, right? That doesn't go away because we have coding robots writing our A and B experiences for us. I do think that in measuring anything is more effortful than not measuring it, but generally speaking, I think a good idea. But yes, I would say that coding assistance certainly, just like it lowers the overall cost of production to get a feature out there, you can write and ship more code more quickly. I think it can help with tasks that may have seemed annoying, either boondoggles for developers that they don't want to spend time on it and they would rather just trust their gut. I think you can sort of delegate that kind of routine work to AIs.
So an analogy just came to mind, and you're the first one to hear this, so congratulations. Tell me how good or not good this is. So as you were saying this, I was thinking about imagine going into a restaurant with quite a robust menu. And imagine a world where you could order everything on the menu at effectively no cost, and it wasn't being wasteful. The food wasn't going to be thrown away. This is some sort of future world where we're defying the laws of physics or whatever. And so literally you could have everything on the menu. It's why choose? I can have everything, right? And so but I guess they still have to bring the plates and put them on the table, and you have to organize them in some way, and you have to figure out which fork is going to go to, there's still overhead associated with that. Yeah. And so what appears to be infinite choice, and who wouldn't want that? I can have one bite of this and one bite of that. And if it didn't cost anything extra and it wasn't wasteful, then who cares, right? But right. I think with this perhaps ridiculous analogy, there still are costs associated with it. If nothing else, where are you going to put stuff on the table? You got to organize it, and there's administration and overhead and just something, even if it is, quote, free, as software development seems to be, at least if not free, approaching a very, very low cost. And to your point, historically, software development was the filet mignon. It was it's very expensive to do software development. And now, comparatively, at least in the type of vibe coding world, it is very cheap to iterate on syntax and code. And so what's the lost in translation is, okay, I've got infinite possibilities, but that carries its own overhead. And then we haven't even gotten to the point well, the code is just one piece of the puzzle. You're trying to build probably a distributed system, and there are databases, and there are systems, and there's fault tolerance and redundancy and quality and all kinds of other things. It rarely is anything just a single screen app anymore. Anything you're trying to do that's got any substance is going to have some dependencies and some complexity that's not going to be probably adequately captured in the vibe coding. So let me pause with that. I just hit you with a lot. What of that sounds ridiculous and is wrong, Jim? Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about, or whatever resonates is possibly right and a good analogy.
I hear what you're saying. I think that product management is probably as important as it's ever been. Certainly, there has been a limiting factor. How quickly can we produce the software, and what is the cost associated with that? And that drives some pragmatic decisions. I think that being able to order everything on the menu sounds exciting, but it also sounds like a big mess. Too much to deal with on your plate, too much to eat, and I think that the customers still want a good experience. They don't necessarily want a kitchen sink experience. They want a curated tool that does the job effectively. And so I don't think that's necessarily like just doing all the things because you can, because those are the things that I think that there's still some editorial discretion required to make a good product.
I love what you just said. That resonates totally with me. Curation, and you talked about it, product management. What's important. And we used in a previous discussion the term taste, right? Not literal taste of the food, but just taste as in cultural taste and a sensibility that in a world of AI where content creation and even application creation could effectively be infinite or close enough to feel infinite, then somebody curating that, having taste, having judgment, having skill, having experience, all of those things matters even more than it did before, right? When you were constrained by like, well, I only got one shot to build this thing. It's going to be extraordinarily expensive. Maybe at that point, development was such a scarce resource, you couldn't help but have taste built in, at least to the degree you could, because you weren't going to waste precious development cycles on something that you hadn't thought through. So does that resonate? Because I know you've also historically pre-AI, you've probably had a whole lot of requirements come to you that didn't feel very well thought through, right? It was a classic criticism I would hear from development teams back to product managers. You're not sure what you want. You haven't thought through this enough. You're asking me to build it, but you're fuzzy in your own mind. Like how does that land to you as an example or an analogy about how things have changed?
Yeah, I think we're still adjusting to the change of pace of development. I think of it as like now you've got AI coding assistants. You were digging with shovels. Now you can dig with an excavator. So you can dig a French drain much more quickly, but it doesn't mean that you want to dig up the whole yard. So yes, I think that taste is still required, and focus is still required. And hopefully we can absorb this new tool, the new accelerated technology that we've got at our disposal, and adjust to it. And that will cause, all areas of software delivery, including product management, will adjust to the pace of it and what's possible. And so, yes, I think that taste is hugely important.
Okay. So let's go back. I sort of glossed over I mentioned the 3 hours a day, which I forget where that number came from. It wasn't Steve Yegi. I haven't read his book, so I didn't see it there, but I saw it somewhere where somebody said, hey, the max you could realistically do for a developer, is sort of 3 hours a day of this, whatever the developer equivalent of vibe coding is. Is that a reasonable way to think about it? And why only 3? Is it that it's so taxing and so mentally intensive that you've got to have time to prep and decompress and or organize the results? Or like tell me about this supposed 3-hour thing, which I honestly, I can't even say exactly where I saw that, but it seemed like a reasonable number? And if not, why not?
Yes, I read that something, either an interview Steve gave or in that book, he made that claim. And maybe it was 3 to 4 hours, maybe it was 2 to 3 hours, but like, he made that claim.
8 to 10, right?
Yeah, it wasn't 8 hours a day. It was well short of 8 hours a day. And he caveated it by saying that this is when you're vibe coding at full speed. And when he's talking about this, he's talking about being able to juggle upwards of 5 to 10 separate development tasks at the same time. Basically, kind of if you imagine like Bobby Fischer playing the multiple games of chess, going from board to board and circling. Yeah. That's what so I have not reached that level of doing it. I have done 2, maybe 3 things at once. And it seems to me that I still continue to kind of have one primary and then some secondary and tertiary tasks that maybe, get some attention as needed. And I have done it for longer than 3 hours. But like, I think that the point is well sustained, which is that despite the fact that we have eliminated the burden of writing individual lines of code, despite the fact that we've eliminated or offset the burden of researching, associated with getting what APIs are available, how would you put this into practice in your technology stack, that essentially what the developers have signed up for is they've signed up for reading a lot of code that someone else has written. Claude is the one writing it. And now you've got to read a lot of code. And to some degree, that is a good thing. And if you're in the driver's seat of developing the feature, it's not exactly the same as, going to do a code review that your coworker made, which is challenging. But like, I do think that process of like reviewing and seeing why it's a change of pace from the way programmers, software engineers have historically worked, in that the creative process is kind of in the writing it down. It's all kind of part of one unit, and you're kind of self-editing as you go. And so that's just different now. That cycle is a lot different.
Well, I really like the Bobby Fischer analogy. I'm going to keep that one in mind, is if you're truly trying to do this at the highest level and be that level of intensity, you're not going to play 8 hours of speed chess, right? I mean, it does take more mental overhead, more processing, even if you're exceptionally good at context switching, which I assume anybody who plays speed chess or multiple games of chess would have to be. It makes sense. That actually then sort of makes perfect sense. Of course, you can't do that for eight hours in a row. And I do want to get to the reading code point you raised, because I think that sort of leads into this whole concept I've been hearing about the dark software factory, right? So just for everybody's benefit, the dark factory concept in the physical world is a factory that has all robots inside. And so if it's just robots and no people, why bother to have the lights on? Because the robots don't need lights. They just sort of work in the dark. And of course, we've talked through this. The first thing that would happen is the minute something goes wrong in the dark factory, what's the first thing you have to do? Turn the lights on so a human can see what's actually going on. And so, people have started saying, what we need to be thinking about is a software factory, number one, and that might be problematic and even offensive to some people, because software development involves skill and experience and curation, as we've talked about, and taste and those kinds of things. So it's not really a factory stamping out, repetitive things. And then, even if you do agree with that premise, are we now going to turn the lights off in it, which implies there are no humans inside? It's just agents developing code, and then when things spit out the end of the factory, presumably that's when they get looked at. So I gave all that as a lead in to your comment about reading code. Is there now dark code? Is there code that just never gets read? Sorry, there's not enough humans and there's not enough hours in the day for the humans to read all of the code that was written, whether it was in a factory or not. And is that okay? Like, how are you thinking about that? And like, what if there's just code, or what if there's a whole lot of code that's just never read by humans anymore? Is that okay?
This is something we're dealing with right now as an industry. I think the answer is going to end up being yes, that's okay. That you read the code you have to read, and the stuff that's like a little simpler, more boilerplate, you can kind of take it for granted. The fact that it's not generating bugs is good. The fact that it doesn't generate test failures is a good sign. And so, yes, I think that kind of like programmers don't, of compiled languages don't go and look at the bytecode unless absolutely necessary. The bytecode or assembly or whatever, you typically don't drop to that level. You stay at the higher level. And I think what software has become, including like interpreted languages like Python, is it's become a runtime of applications, right? And you're just writing for the runtime. And you may care some about the implementation, and especially thorny bits that are super important to get right, that are more likely to attract bugs, that are, critical to your, but boy, there's a lot of login screens and welcome emails and stuff like that in software development too. And I think we can kind of, to some degree, take for granted that it works sometimes, and that's okay.
I just wrote that in, writing for the runtime. I'm not sure I fully understand what it means, but I like it as a phrase. I'm gonna use it. We'll talk later.
Maybe I skipped over some words there, but essentially that, you're defining the parameters under which Claude implements this solution. And that ends up, you care more that the software works and what the experience of it working than exactly like what the implementation looks like.
Yeah. Well, and at the risk of taking your previous analogy about the excavator, right? You started out with a shovel, you got an excavator. That doesn't mean you should dig up the whole backyard. That makes sense. And then to take the analogy one step further, it's like, okay, I'm digging a French drain. Yes, I need to have a trench of a certain depth and width and presumably filling it with gravel or something like that to create the French drain. But I like those are all the details. What I care about is the drainage, right? I want a French drain to drain the water, right? So the problem I'm trying to solve is a drainage problem, probably. If you're talking about a French drain, the hole or the trench and the actual drain that goes in it, and much less how you dig the hole, those are all, I mean, they're important details and they matter a lot to the success of the outcome, but that's not really what you care about, at least from the end user's perspective. How does that analogy land with you in terms of, okay, the people who are defining the business problem that need to be solved don't necessarily care about any of this, right? They care about what problem they're trying to solve.
I think that's true. I think that historically in software, there's been a big emphasis on craftsmanship, elegance of design, and that was a system that was built on the requirement that people be able to understand the code in order to work on it and extend it and maintain it. That code that is inelegant is more likely to attract bugs because there's a higher there's just a higher cost associating with making those changes, and sometimes the developer can't pay those costs, and therefore the management, the maintenance of it, and ends up being flawed. And I think that can still exist with AI coded applications and AI coded code base that AI is working on, but I just think computers have a large capacity for complexity. And so I think that is what has shifted. You're right. Like, it always just mattered if the French drain drained the yard or not. But, and I don't know how French drains and software code bases compare. But if there was a way to say, well, certain French drain designs may be just as effective, but they may be harder to extend in the future. I think that's the idea behind software. And that's why elegance of solution, like not writing a bunch of kludges, it was because you needed to have people. People were the effectors of change. And now you've got computers that can do it, coding robots that can do that job. And they're relatively cheap to operate. And if there's a mess and they need to refactor something, they need to help you turn some product corner that might to a human seem kind of insurmountable, like they have an amazing capacity to do that and to affect change.
And it's interesting to take the French drain analogy one step too far. I'll tell you, one of the things you do with the French drain, either it's a pipe and you wrap a geosynthetic around it, or it's gravel and you wrap a geosynthetic around it. The reason you do that is if you don't, then sand and silt is going to fill it up. It's going to clog your French drain, and then it's not going to drain your water. So proper design of a French drain is what gets you the result in the long term. So I've probably taken that as half a step or 5 steps too far for software development, but I'm glad we got to close the loop on the French drain thing. But I do want to go back to, again, you used the word now craftsmanship. And so we've been talking about these very human words keep coming up, curation, taste, culture, craftsmanship. I mean, those are very artisanal, human words. And I've seen a lot of people start to talk and think about, wow, in an age of AI where the machines can do so much, what's going to be differentiating is not your ability to process and do things, more quickly than the machine, because you're going to have a hard time doing it. What's going to differentiate you is that craftsmanship, that curation, that taste, those things. Although, it probably not manifesting itself in the same way, right? If you're the best tailor and you know how to sew shirts, you probably, once the Industrial Revolution came along, had to very much change how you harnessed that craftsmanship, right? If you just sat there and tried to do it the old way, you wouldn't be able to make a living. You'd get left behind. Does that analogy resonate with you, as given the fact that you said at the beginning, sort of that's what software developers did. They could keep the whole thing in their mind and they could write the code, and that was their craftsmanship. So how does that change in your mind?
Yeah, I think we're moving from writing lines of code to writing systems. And I'm sure that there were people when textiles were industrialized who swore by the old way of doing it, the old by hand way of doing it. and that it would never, this mass production would never take over. And that's what I think of when I think about the shovels and the excavators too. It's like, I'm sure that there've always been people that see like a new technology coming, and they say, and that's where we were last year with vibe coding, and that because the image of the vibe coder last year was somebody who had no idea what they were doing, just racking up tons of technical debt and feeling very good about themselves and pleased with themselves while they were doing it. And I think that has been flipped now, and vibe coding is no longer a bad thing. I think that there are ways you can be more responsible with it and less responsible with it. But as the models have improved a lot, I think that there's like no going back. And I think that to some degree, all of us that came up doing it, like we miss something about the flow state that you get into of like, working through this problem and writing the code and just all the things about it. And that was wonderful. At the same time, I do think we'll see it as the bad old days, because it's actually pretty cool what you can do now if what you care about is affecting lots of change.
Yeah. Well, and there's no going back, I think, is a very appropriate statement. Even if you wanted the old days, there's no practical way to do it. If you try as an individual to do that, you're just going to get left behind as the world moves on. It is my strong belief. And that's probably been true with all kinds of advancements for good or for bad. Everybody can have their own opinion, but the facts are what the facts are. And clearly there's trillions of dollars being spent on AI investments, data centers, the physical world, to everything else that supports that. And clearly this feels like something that's it's not only moving inexorably, it's picking up steam, right? It's the pace seems to be even faster. Yeah. So let me give you one last analogy before we move on here. We've talked about French drains and excavators and all that. What came to mind as we were talking about the human elements, the curation, the craftsmanship, what comes to mind is an iPhone, right? I think an iPhone is a remarkable consumer product for those who are Android users. I mean, pick your own, version of your favorite phone or device. But I don't know that too many people would look at their iPhone and would use words like human and curated and craftsmanship. Maybe on the software induterface, if you like the elegance of Apple's design, there might be that. But just the device itself is sort of the epitome of, sort of industrialization, right? These things are assembled by very finely tuned components that are developed in mass quantities and assembled certainly overseas from the U.S. For all kinds of cost reasons and all the history that's gone into that. But like we don't use words like craftsmanship for an iPhone, I don't think. Or would you say, wow, that iPhone has extraordinary craftsmanship? How's that analogy land with you?
I mean, I think Apple built a reputation on craftsmanship and building things for humans. I think that has changed a little bit in the last 10 years as they've moved from the Steve Jobs era of the company and I think the more primordial innovation era of that company. But I think that was what their culture was. So when I see an iPhone, I do see something that like they put a lot of thought and intentionality into. And a lot of craftsmanship went into the design of it. Now,
so that's actually
when you talk about producing it, yes, I think, but like even, and like the Macintosh, the first Macintosh, the 1984 Mac, Steve Jobs had everybody sign, or I say everybody, it was some core group of the Macintosh team sign the inside of the computer, you know, and that was to signify the human investment and ingenuity that went into it. And and then even, the internals, because the internals of those computers were important too. Like that Apple didn't want it to just look like a chaotic C. There was an emphasis placed early on it being an elegant, good design. Steve Wozniak minimizing the number of chips that were used, which brought down the overall cost, but also just brought down the complexity of the thing and made it more capable. So I think that when it's come to design and stuff at Apple, a lot of that has gone into it. And that's what I think of anyway. Yeah.
Well, and that's an interesting distinction, right? So certainly, they do have the reputation, whether it's drifted or faded, I guess is up to the observer on that. But it was that intentionality, that thoughtfulness, that curation, and maybe even words like, craftsmanship could apply. And then once that's designed in, you have a mass production operation that makes, a billion of these things, right? I mean, so you can't have that level of craftsmanship in the assembly or the creation because it doesn't scale, right? So maybe that's a way of saying that those are not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can have curation, you can have craftsmanship, you can have the human element, and you can have the benefits of effectively mass-produced technology, which I think, at least to some degree, what we think about as the benefits of AI and AI doing coding is, wow, I can do a whole lot more of it, right? So that mass production. But how do I reconcile that human curation with that mass production? And whether the iPhone is a good example of that as it relates to software development, I guess that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that a lot of human ingenuity and creativity goes into the creation of mass production lines. And I have a lot of respect for people who are just working on the individual devices. As someone who's replaced an iPhone screen a couple of times before myself, that's a very, very difficult and challenging thing to do. And I think it was like after the third or fourth one, I was like, I'm never doing this again.
You need to you can pay people who do that a lot, right? Yeah, I didn't even bother to try. Once they sent me the tool to pry the screen off, I'm like, oh wow, this is not made for me. That's right. And Apple to some degree is trying to lock us out of doing. Of course, it's not in their interest to have us repair our phones. So yeah, no, totally get that.
But as to the production lines and stuff, I mean, I think you brought up the dark software factory. And so what is the future of production software? I mean, I think that we're in a period now where we're in the Mechs era, right? Like we're in the Mechs era. What I mean by that is when we put on Claude Code, it's like strapping, a mechanized armor suit onto the human, making them super powerful, making them more capable. I think that what we'll increasingly do is move to a more industrial approach where people are spent setting up the robot armies. The effort will go into setting up, being the prime movers of software that generates software. And maybe we can, and maybe once that's stood up, we can have it iterate on that old process and create those factories for us. But like, I do think that is where the human craftsmanship and ingenuity and capital will be spent, will be on that.
Well, and it's interesting. The mechs versus robot army. I mean, that's sort of implicitly a military and adversarial. It sort of brings to mind Terminator and all the dystopian things that certainly people have concerns about, but maybe less militaristically and more pragmatically. I mean, sort of the idea of the dark software factory is the same idea, right? I'm not going to strap on a co-working apparatus, metaphorically, not literally, that helps me work 30% faster. I'm going to redesign the process so that I don't have to be in the middle of it at all, right? I've got the robots doing it, and then the role of the human changes, fairly dramatically in that, right? I'm helping set it up. I'm helping make sure we inspect the output or have the right harnesses to instrument and test the output, or like even define in some ways how to talk about all of this, right? I have found myself tripping over words sometimes in a different context. I think you've heard this story where I was talking about what we really need is a token engineer, which sounds like a joke, a token engineer on no, I mean an engineer who understands tokens in the context of AI. So I use that as an illustration, not of software development, but like how just our language has to evolve too. We have to be able to talk about this before we can build it and make it a reality. We all have to be able to talk about it. And not surprisingly, between sort of the business and the technology, historically, that's been one of the real challenges, and one of the skills of a good product manager is that translation layer. Hey, let me take all this business speak, which may or may not resonate with you. Let me take all this development speak, which may or may not resonate with you, and let me marry those together and help provide that translation layer. How does that analogy land with you?
I think that's right. I do think that's the situation we're in right now, is that you've got to give AI tasks to do. Who decides what those tasks are, specifies them, and validates them, and just who kicks the process off, and how does it get kicked off? And that's what we'll be looking at more. I think that the answer's going to be more AI, not less AI. I don't think it's just keeping humans in the loop all the time. I think that the humans move up the food chain to higher order work and to spend their time looking at, indicators. If you think about software testing and quality assurance, especially automated testing, the idea there is to write software that validates that the system under test performs the functional requirements. And I think that we will do a version of that. We will continue to do that, but we will also do more versions of quality assurance and observability that will give us the indicators so that we can kind of step back and just monitor like the big board and the big picture and aren't worried as much about the details of how it gets done.
When you just said something interesting is worth calling out here. I mean, maybe it's not wildly surprising given the subject of this podcast and what we do, but more AI, not less, I think is worth just sort of putting a stake in the ground as both a prediction and maybe, not to put words in your mouth, what you think should happen, right? As we genuinely try to solve problems for our clients, for our customers in the world of transportation, how do we go about doing that, right? We've got scarce resources, time, money, people, technology. How do you best apply those? And in many ways, that is the concept of engineering, right? You've heard me use the analogy before. If you're building a bridge and it takes 5 steel I-beams to support the deck for an appropriate load with the appropriate safety factor, you don't put 10 I-beams in just because if you do that, then you're going to build fewer bridges, right? You're spending too much. So that concept of, organizing, adjusting, that's also project management. How do I orchestrate a sequence of activities? So there's lots of places where, we have to make those kinds of trade-offs. And it feels like in a world of AI, we're doing that as well. And clearly the rules have changed, whereas in the world of building bridges, physics, laws of physics don't just change, right? The beams are what the beams are. The beam, maybe you can get a higher strength steel or things like that, but those are typically incremental changes. But if somebody came along with, sort of bridge building capabilities and now steel I-beams were, 1,000 times stronger, 1/1000th the cost and light enough for a human to carry, well, that would pretty much fundamentally change everything. And it feels like that to some degree, whether those numbers are accurate or not, it feels like that's what's happened in the world of software development, where some long-standing 20, 30, 40-year expectations of what was possible are no longer true. Would you agree with that statement?
I would agree.
Well, that's a pretty profound topic. So I'm glad we're talking about it. So we're about to run out of time, but I want to ask you one thing before we wrap up, and that is sort of the team, right? So we're a small company and we have a small team, and you and I have talked a lot about, do we want senior developers? Do we want junior developers? Do we want interns? Do we want, people in offshore locations who you can hire at a better unit cost versus people here, which are going to cost more, and all the trade-offs, and there's lots of opinions and things wrapped up in that. But like we've been, it feels like all over the map in terms of at least exploring ideas. Is there any, if you were offering advice to people as they think about software development in 2026 and beyond, and they're thinking about how to build a team, what distillation do you have in your mind, if any, and what advice would you offer about at least how to think about it? Maybe not the answer itself, but how do you think through that?
Well, I would give this advice, which is to acknowledge the fact that the needs have changed. You don't need somebody to just be a coder anymore. So that the obvious economic values and costs have adjusted in that way. That said, good people are still important to a company. And I don't think that, as I currently understand it, that we're hiring, people who their toolkit may change markedly within a year. But that's okay because we're not hiring a toolkit, we're hiring people. Yeah. And we're investing in good people. And so I would say that the idea that you're hiring people that can add to your team, that are good coworkers, that's as true today as ever was, that you'll benefit from that. And that's kind of why we're taking the approach of hiring at different levels, because we believe that will be borne out regardless of how AI code generation changes the unit work. that those people
Yeah,
do.
that's well said, and it actually does tie back to what we were talking about earlier with the importance of the curation and the taste that we talked about and the craftsmanship. That, whether that literally applies to every task people are doing or not. I mean, it certainly applies at the human level, right? We've been talking about human attributes, and what you just said is another way of really what we're looking for is the humans. What's the right kind of skill set? What's the right kind of attributes? Collaboration, personality, motivation, lots of, again, we're for a podcast on AI, we're spending an awful lot of time talking about some very human things, which I think is interesting. And also, I think I'm a technology optimist by nature, but it also genuinely, I think, grounds us in, okay, is AI going to sort of benefit us as humans as we move forward? Certainly we hope so, but these very human things we're talking about, more important, not less, it seems to be the direction these conversations are going.
Absolutely.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think we're out of time here. So, John, I want to thank you for a great conversation here today and for joining us on the show. This is At the Intersection. I'm your host, Jim Anderson. And today we talked with John Maxwell, the Chief Technology Officer at Beacon Software. And so we had a great conversation, covered a lot of topics. And so, John, I want to thank you for joining us. And we look forward to welcoming everybody back to a future episode. Thanks very much.
Hey, thanks so much.